See if we can save some time here. So you all think that you're inclusive, open-minded, and tolerant, don't you? After all, you volunteered to be here, right? Well, let's see how open-minded and tolerant you are. Can you really walk your talk? Well, some research by Patricia Devine and her colleagues at the University of Wisconsin gives us some insight into the dilemma. And that dilemma is, most of us value being open and tolerant, and at the same time, we're all breathing the smog of discrimination and prejudice. And somehow we have to make sense out of both of those sets of messages. Now, what she did was she put a group of people into a low prejudice and a high prejudice group based on test scores. Then she gave them a series of scenarios. And here's an example of one of them. Imagine you're on a crowded bus. It's during a rush hour. There's only one seat left, and it's right next to you. At the next stop, another group of people get on, and one of them is this fairly large-sized African-American man, and he's walking your way. In fact, he's eyeing that seat. What I want you to do next is rate how uncomfortable should you feel. I'll give you 5 more scenarios. In this particular study, they were focusing on race, so all of them had race incident scenarios. But suppose I had you rate all of those, take them back from you, and give them back to you again. But this time I asked you to rate how uncomfortable would you feel. Now, what the researchers assumed was that should reminds us of our societal values that we've learned, and would actually puts us in the behavior, in the situation, and then we have to figure out how we'd actually behave. Now, you'd think that people who are high prejudice would rate that I should feel uncomfortable, and I would. And just the opposite for the people, as we look here, for the folks who are in the low prejudice position. But it turns out that of those low prejudice people, about 71% of them had responses that made their shoulds look very similar to the people who were liberal, but their woulds were very similar to the people who were prejudiced. Now, what they concluded was that this is an interesting result, but we got to find out more. So what they did was they told the people who had these discrepancies between their scores that they had this gap between their shoulds and their woulds. And what happened was these folks began to feel guilt and shame. And they would say, you know, that's not how I see myself. In fact, what can I do so that my beliefs and values are in alignment with the way that I want to perceive myself and others to perceive me? That's where we come to what I refer to as ambivalent inclusion. These are two opposing values that most of us hold. On the one hand, we consciously value being perceived as and thinking of ourselves as open, tolerant, and inclusive. On the other hand, because we breathe the smog of prejudice and discrimination, somehow we have to reconcile those two. And the way in which we do that is that we end up superimposing our beliefs about ourselves that we really like over those situations in which the ugliness of our society tends to rise above unconsciously playing havoc on our everyday lives. Now, can we give them unconscious bias training to help them? Well, it turns out that there's lots of evidence that the Google employee who wrote the email about questioning whether female employees had the wired capability to be as great as guys are in doing tech work. There's lots of evidence that he had culture bias training. And it didn't seem to serve him as well as it could have. And that's for the following reason, at least in part. One is that unconscious bias training assumes that we're wired to be biased and discriminate. As a result, it's much too easy for people to basically say, hey, listen, since that's the way we all are, why don't we just live with it and get back to work? Well, I'm a cognitive cultural psychologist by training. And what I've learned is something a little bit different. What I've learned is that we as human beings, we have a lot of information impinging on us at any one time. But we're wired, fortunately enough, to make sense out of all that information by putting them into categories. And that way we can learn from our experience and deal with all of that complexity. Now, the meaning that we put on any one category comes from social learning. So we can have one category in one culture that is very similar to another culture, but there's two different meanings. Let's take a look at how this might work. And this is from anthropology. In matrilineal societies, a big, muscular guy with lots of presence may be meek, mild, and caring. And everybody sees him that way. In a patrilineal society, that same individual, they need him to be the most aggressive and mean guy as possible. Why? Because in matrilineal society, according to this research, there's a basket of plenty. There's lots to go around. In patrilineal societies, they're constructed in a way that there's at least a perception of, if not the reality, that there isn't much to go around. So you have to compete for it. So you need tough people to help you get what you and your people need. Well, how does ambivalence inclusion fit into this whole thing? Does it add any value? Well, one way is that it tells us that there are blind spots, number one. But second of all, it's based on the assumption that we can uncover those blind spots in a meaningful way. In addition to that even though we learn some biases, those biases can be unlearned. But first, we have to be able to be willing to open up ourselves to see our blind spots. Blind spots make it very difficult for us to hear negative feedback. That's one of the problems. So we got to find a way to help people be able to do that. Take the manager who hires an African-American staff person, and he's proud of it because he's the best qualified person for the job. She goes up for promotion twice, and he is the gatekeeper, and he turns her down. The second time, she reports him to HR for racial discrimination, and he's upset. He said, I've given this person a job. She's good. She's just not ready. What he's not aware of is that when he's making those decisions, he is also thinking about her hairstyle, the way she talks, and the way she dresses. And for him, they are not professional enough. But those things are hidden. Although they creep up for him on occasion, he doesn't think they have a whole lot of weight. And because she's turned him in, he's really upset. He thinks that he has been betrayed by her because he has shown her in all kinds of ways that he is open and tolerant. And his ego, as a result, is very fragile. These blind spots continue this cycle of exclusion. And that's the problem. So how do we get people out of it? Well, one way that we get people out of it is and what I've found, is to help them engage in self-confrontation. Rather than me just hitting them between the eyes and says, you are being racist, instead, I'm going to be soft on people and hard on the problem. The problem here is that he can't see his blind spot, so I'm going to help him. And here's how I'm going to help them. There's a couple of exercises. There's many more, but here's some interesting ones. The first one was used by Qualcomm with their managers. It's called a social capital assessment. And it's a bunch of checklists on your attitude, awareness, knowledge, and skills. And you're just checking them off in terms of what applies to you. Now, if you use this with a 360-degree feedback, you can get something from the people who work under you, colleagues below you, your supervisors, and it helps you see whether or not how you see yourself is the way other folks see you too. And it's an eye-opener for folks. But even if you use it yourself and you're honest with yourself, you can learn a lot. The other one is called ambivalent inclusion. Ambivalent inclusion is called How Inclusive Are You? That is a checklist of values and beliefs for different cultural groups. Gender is one, race and ethnicity is another, disability, there's all kinds of groups. But what you can do is do these checklists. If you do it honestly, you'll see that certain groups you have more value for than others. And then you have to ask yourself, how is that going to have, what implications is that going to have on your doing good work and inclusive work? So get people to look at themselves who have a very difficult time doing so by making certain that you give them an opportunity to do some kind of self-evaluation. I thank you for your time and appreciate your being here.